If you can paint portraits, then you're probably a superhero. If not, well, then you're probably like me and the rest of the world. Now, this is a skill I have always wanted to have, but rather than spending countless hours practicing going through canvas after canvas, I wanted to know if there was a way to cheat at painting portraits. And so, introducing painting with cross-stitching patterns. Back in college, I decided it was a good idea to get a head start on learning how to be a grandma, so I developed skills like knitting, embroidering, and cross-stitching. While working on a cross-stitch portrait of Elvis, the idea struck me. If a cross-stitching pattern can tell me what color thread to put where, why shouldn't I be able to translate this to paint color? Which leads us to step 1 of painting with cross-stitching patterns. Take a picture. For this step, simply rip a portrait of someone off the internet like I did for Elvis, or bribe your younger sibling into being your photographer for an hour. After sorting through a few dozen photos, we found a winner, which narrowly beat out the second place finisher. Once you have your picture, head over to pic2pat.com. This is a free website that enables you to turn any picture into a cross-stitching pattern. Simply upload your picture, choose your parameters, and voila, a cross-stitching pattern. When you get your pattern, every symbol corresponds to a thread or floss color, and the goal here will be to mix the color in paint instead of using thread. And now to go shopping. For this project, I got a canvas and a very small paintbrush, this DMC thread guide that will help with color matching when mixing the paint, and of course, oil paint. Why is it $30? You know, like... In order to paint with this cross-stitching pattern, the canvas will need a grid that resembles a 14-count fabric. There's a link in the description for the fabric I'm using here. Now, stretching the fabric itself is an option, but it's likely to leave a bunch of tiny holes in the final painting. To avoid this, I'm stretching the fabric over a regular canvas, and I will then use a fine-tip Sharpie to mark where each hole in the cross-stitch fabric is. Removing the fabric will leave just a Sharpie grid on the canvas. Yeah, sounds pretty good. This process took well over 5 hours, and I definitely punched several holes in the canvas. But in the end, it was worth it, because we had our grid. Whew. All right, moment of truth. Hey! It's not that bad. It's not that bad. My painting process consisted of choosing a symbol off of the pattern and then using the DMC color guide to mix a paint color to match as closely as possible to the thread color. Now, color matching is definitely not my strong suit, so believe it or not, mixing 138 colors took longer than actually painting with them. So, after several attempts, I had my first color and the painting commenced. The next several minutes is a time-lapse of the painting process with a few observations and hiccups documented along the way. If you'd like to skip to these talking points, these are the timestamps for you. And don't worry, I'll keep them on the screen. If you're feeling bold and want to skip ahead to see the final painting, head over to this timestamp. As I'm sure you can see, the canvas is completely blank other than the Sharpie grid that I added using the cross-stitch fabric. So, when I first started painting, I would look at the pattern for a certain symbol and then count squares within the grid to find its corresponding location on the canvas. This process was very time-consuming and allowed a lot of room for mistakes. To remedy this, I started marking with a pencil which squares needed to be painted before adding the color. I still had to count the squares in order to do this, but it took away a lot of room for error because I could erase and make changes before actually adding the paint. At this point, I was feeling a bit uneasy about the skin tone on the portrait. I personally would not describe my skin as mocha or cocoa anything,
the exception being iced white chocolate mocha.
But I just made the assumption that it would look more like my actual skin tone as more colors were added. Pretty much, the only aesthetic concern I had going into this painting was that I didn't want the pattern to call out my coffee-stained teeth and tell me to put a bunch of yellow on there, but that certainly would have hurt less than green. Nothing could have prepared me for the amount of green on Portrait Me's teeth. One thing I wanted to point out about using the DMC color guide as the reference for mixing the paint colors is that it not only saved me from buying $70 worth of embroidery floss, but it also organized the floss into color families, which made identifying the undertones of each color much easier. For example, if I wanted to mix this brown color, starting from a darker burnt umber, I could look above the color and see that it can be lightened using a pale orange, compared to this brown above it, which would need to be lightened with pink. I got better at this process as the painting progressed, but that didn't stop me from admitting defeat on a few colors and calling it close enough. For the first time in weeks, I looked at the colored version of the pattern so that I could kind of freestyle fill in all the holes in the flower crown when I realized that I was missing an entire shoulder. And in the process of discovering this, I also realized that the skin tone will in fact not get better as more colors are added because I mixed those colors so terribly wrong. So, 4 hours later, I fixed a few colors. I'm convinced that I went into a dark closet and then closed my eyes to make those colors the first time because the difference is incredible. Though it took a lot of time, I'm very glad to have fixed it. And now to finish the flower crown. And now, the final result. All in all, this painting took around 100 hours to complete. Now, could I have dedicated those 100 hours to researching how to actually paint portraits and practiced at least a dozen times? Absolutely. But for not having to put any thought into what the next color will be or where it will go, I am very satisfied with this method. And when compared to the actual photo and to the photo that the pattern predicted, it's pretty darn close. The face lacks a little bit of depth, but as I'm sure we are all aware by now, that is user error and is no fault of the pattern. So, if you have a few dozen hours to spare and a lot of patience, I would say this is a pretty solid way to cheat at painting portraits.